Hello, this is May 11th, and we are discovering your spiritual type. Let's get going. And before we get into the meat of what we'll be talking about today, I have a question for you. It's a question of definitions. How would you define the word spirituality? As Lutherans, as I've told you before, this spirituality isn't part of our natural vernacular. We often use terms like piety to talk about what other folks would call spirituality. How do you live out your faith? Well, what does your faith look like in your life? How does it impact your life? So the definition that I have for spirituality, the working definition I had for my doctoral research, is spirituality is the lived experience of the sacred. And one of the things I found really interesting, especially when working with my dissertation committee, folks who are helping me guide me through the process of writing it, evaluating it along the way. It's kind of like an ongoing defense. We're doing constant rewrites and that sort of thing. And we had a variety of people on that committee. We had a pastor, we had a theologian, and we had a medical sociologist who was very conversant with the language of the church, of faith, and that sort of thing. And what was interesting was that the theologian and the pastor were kind of like, yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. The medical sociologist was thinking from a sociological perspective. He goes, what do you mean by sacred? And I thought that question was an awesome one. It totally exposed my bias, or as we say in my world of academia, my location, because I assumed people had a common definition of the sacred. The sacred, of course, the things of God, the things of the divine, isn't that what everyone defines as sacred? But apparently from a sociological perspective, and I found this really interesting and really helped me open up my own understanding of the sacred, is that the sacred is something which can't be altered, something that can't be touched, something that is honored, something that is loved and cared for. It doesn't need to have any religious or spiritual packaging around it. And I remember sitting with a friend, having a couple of beers at the local pub, and he's a local activist, and he's not a churchgoer. He's self-professed atheist or agnostic, but he was talking about the value of telling sacred stories. So I asked him that question, well, what do you mean by sacred? He thought I was kind of forcing my religious stuff on him at first, but I said, no, I just want to know, how do you define sacred? And for him, that's what it was as well. It was a sense of beauty and value and things that bring out life in the world. And I think that's a wonderful definition of sacred. That's a wonderful definition of spirituality. And I think definitions are wonderful to talk about because we often assume, especially in the language of the church and the language of faith, we assume that everyone knows what we're talking about. We assume that we mean the same thing when we use certain words. So the word spirituality, I'm going to define it as I had before earlier in my dissertation. Spirituality is a lived experience of the sacred. And by the sacred, I mean that which is coming from the divine life, coming from God. And in spirituality, my own definition of spirituality, it is to make the world thrive with life, that Christ is incarnate in all things, that Jesus is revealed not just in me, but in everything that God has created, that God has chosen the world as a means of love. So I ask you, what is your definition of spirituality? What is spirituality for you? How about you write that down in the comments or write it down in our Facebook book or Facebook group or whatever. Let me know, what is your definition of spirituality? Also, I'm going to be supplying a link for the spirituality type indicator that Corinne Ware came up with, and that'll add more to the conversation as you figure out where you fall in the spirituality wheel that I shared on Sunday.